Hello and welcome to Dig School, cross-curricular learning themed around archaeology. This is a Thorney Problem, a session in which we'll explain a strange collection of human bones. Key questions we'll be asking are how can we use different strands of evidence to explain a collection of human bones? What can studying evidence for disability, medical treatment and medical practice tell us about the past? And why does this matter? So normally when archaeologists find collections of lots of human bones together, they usually come from a cemetery and they're usually skeleton by skeleton. But the Thorney Bones collection was very different. They had been dug up in a garden, the garden you can see here, and when they came to us, they were presented in a box, as you can see them there, just a collection of bones. So to explore those, you'll need to start to get familiar with the human skeleton and some of the names of the bones. So I've put a diagram up there from the Encyclopedia Britannica with all of the names showing the skeletons from back and front. Now you can come back to that at any point during the presentation if you want to go back and check and learn the names of the bones. What we're going to do now is go through some of the bones from the Thorney Bones. I'm going to show you 9 examples. Some of them are just a single bone, some of them are 2 or 3 together. For each of those, I'd like you to write down, firstly, what part of the body you think the bone's from. And write down the name if you can, or if you want to go back and check so you can learn it, then do that and have another look at that skeleton diagram I've just shown you. Write down what you think is noteworthy or abnormal about that bone or those bones. I'll give you a chance to sort of have a look for yourselves and see if you can spot what's a bit strange or different about it. And then I'll show you the answers to that. So as soon as you know, write that down in your booklet. Say also whether you think that modification, that abnormality, whatever makes it a bit strange, occurred during somebody's lifetime or after they were dead. And then say why you think that modification or that abnormality happened. Again, you'll be able to pick up the answers to this from the analyses I give you once you've had a chance to think for yourselves. So here's the first example. It's the bone is on the right, as you can see there. It's a single bone, but it was in several pieces when it came to us, and it's just been taped gently back together, as you can see. So I put a picture broadly of the part of the skeleton it comes from, so you've got a bit of a clue in there. So just have a look and see what you think is odd or abnormal or unusual about that particular bone. Okay, so you've had a chance to have a look for yourselves. Well, there were a couple of things that were unusual about this actually. It's got a wound, an injury, and it's also actually stained. So it's the frontal skull bone, so it's this part of the skull up to the sort of sutures that go around sort of the middle of the skull that you can see on the reconstruction diagram there. So it's the front part of the bone, and there's a sort of dimple mark just in the middle of it there. There's no evidence of any new bone growth around it, so that suggests it happened either around the time the person died or shortly afterwards. It's quite a dent. The skull is a solid bone and it's made quite a dent in it, but it wouldn't necessarily have been fatal, and we can't tell just from this bit of bone whether that injury killed the person or whether they just happened to be injured like that around the time they died. The other abnormality is a bit of green staining you can see on the bottom part of the skull fragment. Now that is something that would have resulted from a bit of metal. Copper typically leaves that sort of a green stain. A bit of metal being against the skull while it was in the grave. From the position, it's sort of in this kind of place. It is absolutely typical, the sort of mark we get when someone, particularly a woman, has been buried with a headdress or a veil which has had pins holding it in place. So that might well be what that's from. This is a bone that's definitely been buried in the ground. Anyway, just to point out those that puncture wound and then that staining there as well. So this is the next example. So have a look at this and see if you can work out which bone it is and what makes it a bit abnormal or a bit unusual. So you've had a chance to have a look at that and think. Well, the really abnormal thing about this, it's a tibia, the right tibia, one of the lower leg bones, but it's a lot thicker at the proximal end, the upper end, than is normal. And there's also a small hole that's just pointed out with that arrow there called a cloaca, which is also not normal. And these are both strongly suggestive of osteomyelitis, which is caused by infection, where an infection that's got to the bone has affected the bone, caused it to grow in a different way. Obviously, the question is, how did the infection get there? There's no evidence of a fracture or a broken bone, which might have introduced an infection. So it may well just have been a soft tissue infection, perhaps an injury to the muscle, which then got infected and then got down deep to the bone. It would cause an ulcer, which eventually would need to be cleaned out. Would have pus and probably dead bone in it, so really quite unpleasant. You'd probably need surgery or at least some very good cleaning out and packing with some sort of antiseptic to make that bone heal, make that infection clear up. So this is the next example. So have a look at this bone, see if you can guess what it is, see if you remember the name of it, and see what you think is abnormal about it. So you've had a chance to have a look at this, and you can see here it's the left femur, so that's the upper leg bone, the thigh bone. And I think the abnormality there is fairly obvious. There's a big lump on the side of it. This is myositis ossificans, usually caused when there's been a hematoma, a sort of blood blister, forming by the surface of the bone, which again causes the bone to grow in a strange way. So it's formed this really large lump, which looks really quite nasty, but it's not actually particularly dangerous. It's certainly not a cancer or anything like that. The hematoma may have been caused by one very hard blow to the leg, but it could have been from repeatedly banging the leg, which might have happened if someone had an occupation that involved that. For instance, a cobbler who might have put the shoe on their knee to sort of bang at it repeatedly over a sort of lifetime of work. It's an interesting, unusual medical example. So here's the next example. Again, have a look at this, see if you can work out what bone it is and what makes that of special interest. So you've had a chance to have a look at that now. I'm sure you worked out that it is the skull again. What's interesting about this, it's a craniotomized skull. In fact, there are two skulls. Those are two separate bones there. The one at the top, as you can see, is in one piece. The one at the bottom is actually in three bits when we got it, and we again taped it carefully back together. But they've both had exactly the same procedure applied to them, which is cutting off the top of the skull around where the red line is there. This is a procedure that was done sort of sometimes to investigate cause of death, but often just to demonstrate the brain. So it's used in medical teaching quite often. Students are expected to be able to do a craniotomy in some cases. And you can see here, particularly in the lower of those two examples, there's actually been two separate cut lines. And that shows that the skull has been cut through from the back and through from the front, and they haven't quite lined up. So it's possible that this was someone who was being taught or learning how to do this craniotomy, because it hasn't been done as neatly. The top example is a much more skillfully carried out craniotomy. These sorts of procedures weren't carried out very widely before about the 17th century, though we do occasionally find medieval examples. It's just showing those two lines or those two cuts that didn't quite match up. So here's the next example. Again, these are two separate bones. So have a think about which bone you think those might be, and again, what's abnormal about them. Okay, so you've had a chance to think about that. They're both tibia bones, so they're lower leg bones. They're interestingly, they're both left legs, so they don't come from the same person. But they do both have very similar injuries on them. They have been very severely broken. You can see what the normal bone looks like. These ones are clearly not in alignment. They're sort of doubled up against each other. These bones would have been broken completely through, but the person clearly survived that injury, which if it was sustained in a period before modern medicine could have potentially been very dangerous. Any broken bone, particularly a serious break like this, which is likely to pierce the skin, certainly damaged muscle, very, very vulnerable to infection. But they definitely survived it because the bone healed. Those two broken bits of the bone grew back together. But at the point at which they were doing this, the bones hadn't been set in the right position. So instead of growing back with the broken edges completely matched so that they grew back to heal perfectly, they were actually overlapping, which means that the bones are fused together, overlapping. That would have left someone not only with a rather funny shaped leg, but also, much more seriously, with one leg considerably shorter than the other. In the left-hand example that the arrow is pointing up there, the lower end of the tibia is actually twisted as well, so the foot would have been out of alignment. And in both of these cases, the thickened bone around the bottom is evidence of arthritis, which shows the effect of having to walk awkwardly. If one leg is 2 or 3 inches shorter than the other, you're going to walk very unevenly, and that puts a strain on the bones, and that causes the arthritis. So here's the next example. Have a look at that and see if you can think where that's from and what's unusual about it. This is 2 photographs of the same bone, one from the front and one from the back. So you've had a chance to have a look at this and think about these. Well, these are fibulas. That's the other lower leg bone. Also very severely broken. We don't know whether this fibula is from the same person that either of the tibias we looked at just now were from. We could only possibly do that if we found the skeleton buried in a grave, which we haven't got, or at a very slim chance from DNA, but we don't have that evidence, and it's often very difficult to get DNA from bone. The break here again has healed, so that person clearly survived, but again that bone hasn't been set properly, so it hasn't healed in the right alignment. And in fact, this bone, as you can see from the example on the left there of the normal bone, that bone should be completely straight, a nice thin straight bone. Fibula is the thinner of the 2 leg bones, and it's nothing like that. It is healed at a crazy angle, in fact. The person whose leg it was would have been unable to bear weight on it, and they would have needed a lot of help getting around. They would have been severely immobilized. If you reconstruct the angle of that bone, what you've actually got is a lower leg that sticks out something like that. So you've got someone who's really very disabled, not completely incapable of getting around. They'd have needed a crutch or someone to help them, but certainly very, life would be very difficult for them moving around. So this is the next example. Have a look at this. Again, this is just one example, one photograph from the back and one from the front. So have a think about where you think this is from, what it's called, and what's abnormal about it. So you've had a chance to have a look at these. And this is the right hand femur. And this, again, is a bone that has fused, but it's fused where it really shouldn't have done. So this is the top of the femur, the top of the thigh bone, where it goes into the pelvis. But in this example, the thigh bone is actually fused to the pelvis. The bone has grown to be a single bone. That would have made any movement of that leg from the hip completely impossible. It's like trying to bend your arm in the middle. It won't bend, it's a solid bone. That's what's happened here. In fact, the leg is fused at an angle of about 180 degrees from the norm. So it's not even fused straight, it's fused bent right up. There's no evidence of any injury to the joint, which might have caused that. So it may be simply that the hip got dislocated at some point. And that might have been due to something like a congenital abnormality, which made that hip joint slightly looser, slightly more prone to becoming dislocated. Again, today that sort of thing can be treated. In pre-modern periods, there was really nothing you could do about that. The angle at which this bone would have been jammed permanently is demonstrated here. It looks like this is the most uncomfortable angle you could possibly have it at, but it did at least mean the person could sit up rather perhaps than having to lie down in bed all the time. Whether they chose to fix it in that position or whether that was just how it happened to grow, probably if there's an abnormality anyway and the joint was compromised, which was causing it to become problematic in the first place, they may have well have spent a lot of time sitting down anyhow. So here's the next example. Have a look at these and see what you think is different or unusual about them. Okay, you've had a minute to look at those. These are three bones from the lower half of the body, a left femur, a right tibia, and part of the sacrum, the sort of very bottom of your spine, around your bottom. And these bones have all been sawn, so you can see the very sharply sawn off ends. This must have happened either soon around the time of death, as though no remodelling of bone, and we've seen how bone will remodel, even if it's seriously broken. If it's a person still alive, bone will regrow, will try and heal itself. There's no sign of that on these, and indeed the sacrum, that's the bottom of the spine, that's not a survivable amputation anyway. This may have been used to practice amputations, or they may have been amputations that were carried out in an attempt to save someone's life and failed. The two long bones, the femur and the tibia, are quite smoothed on the surface. That suggests they've been handled a lot. So that makes one wonder if there may have been they may have been teaching or training. Perhaps someone was training how to carry out an amputation, and perhaps then those bones were kept to be demonstrated. You can see on the middle one there's a slight notch where the bone's broken off, which is not perfect, but very common. And then finally, here's this collection of bones. Have a look at these and see if you can spot what's unusual about them. Might take some quite careful looking here. So looking at these, they're all bones of the hand or lower arm. It's the left radius, the left ulnar, and the metacarpal bones, the sort of main bits of the hand bones. The thing that's unusual about these is they've got wires and drill holes through them. Now, when people are alive, there are tendons that hold bones together. You don't need drill holes and wires in them. But the position of these wires and the position of the holes is absolutely classic for when a skeleton has been reassembled for display purposes, so to be put up, stood up as if it was in a standing live position. There's only one of each of these bones, so they probably all came from one skeleton. It suggests that somebody owned a single display skeleton. Several of these bones, again, are worn quite smooth, suggesting they've been handled over a long period of time. So, have a look through your notes about the bones, and while you've got the thoughts fresh in your head, just write out a couple of sentences which sort of summarise what you're thinking about them. Remember, we're trying to work out why all these bones turned up in a garden in the middle of Cambridgeshire. So write a couple of sentences. First one should begin, the bones are all different, but they have some things in common because most of them say what you think a common theme running through some or all of the bones is. Then the next sentence, your thoughts at the moment. I think the bones ended up in this garden because. And you don't have all the evidence at the moment, but have a think about what could possibly have caused a collection of bones like that to end up buried in someone's garden. We'll come back in part 2 and have a look at a bit more background information, see if that helps come up with an explanation. So in part 2 of Thorney Bones, we're going to go back to that question we set at the end of part 1. So why did all these bones end up in this Cambridgeshire garden? And we'll have a look at some historical context for the area where the bones were found. So there's a map of this bit of Thorney, there's an arrow pointing to where the bones came from. So what I'm going to do now is summarise a little bit of the historical information that we know. And there's a huge amount, so I'll just tell you a little bit. And for each of those summaries, stop and then discuss whether you think that anything in that information could help explain what those bones are doing in that garden, why they were brought together, why they ended up there. And then write down your answers and try and explain why you're coming up with those answers. What's the evidence you've got to support that suggestion? So the first question really is, could the bones be prehistoric or Roman? Certainly we often do find, particularly Roman cemeteries, prehistoric burials for some periods, but actually there's no known prehistoric Roman archaeological burials near the site of the Thorney Bones at all. So the next question then, moving sort of forward in time, is could the bones be medieval? Well, there was a monastery at Thorney, founded in the 7th century, AD 662. We don't know precisely where that was, but it may well have been on the site of the later medieval monastery, which is very close to the Thorney Bones site. When the monastery was refounded in AD 972, it followed the rule of St. Benedict, and the layout of the monastery is likely to have followed a standardised plan, because the ones we find nearly always do. And we actually have an example of a depiction of this standardised plan from a monastery at a place called St. Gall. And when we compare this plan with the Thorney Bones site, we can see that actually the garden those bones came from is very much in the area where we would expect the cemetery of the monastery to be, because the cemeteries are usually southeast of the church, and our Thorney Bones site is southeast of the monastic church at Thorney. So did medieval monasteries have hospitals? It's a bit of a medical thread running through all these bones, as I'm sure you noted. Certainly St Benedict required that monasteries should have an infirmary for the sick and the ill, and that they should be looked after as a special Christian duty. Is the wording of his rule here, or translation of it. The care of the sick is to be placed above and before every other duty, as if indeed Christ were being directly served in waiting on them. It must be the peculiar care of the abbot that they suffer from no negligence. The infirmarian should be thoroughly reliable, known for his piety, and diligence and solicitude for his charge. When we look at the St Gall plan, and here's a picture of it, and here's a map of Thorney on the right, I've circled the church in both of them in red there, and I've marked where the cemetery is on the bottom right-hand corner of that 860 and 837 plan, the original St Gall plan. And as you can see, it's just in the sort of bottom right-hand side of the church, and that's exactly where our Thorney Bones location is compared to the church at Thorney. Interestingly, when we look at the St Gall plan, we can also see it's got an infirmary and chapel and a physician's house with a garden where the physician would have grown the herbs and other medications that they would have used. So we can see from that that Thorney Bones site very much sits close to the monastic church. The church that's there today is the same one that was there for the monastery. And it does look like it might have been quite close to the cemetery. So what then did medieval hospitals do? Well, there is a hospital recorded specifically at Thorney in the 10th, 11th century. This would have been for sick monks and also for members of the public, quite possibly, and perhaps those disabled by illness or injury so that they were destitute, had no other way of surviving. Some of these people may even have been buried in the monastic cemetery. There were no doctors in medieval hospitals as such. The monks or nuns would have had general nursing skills, a good knowledge of herbal medicines, but medieval medical training didn't include dissection, it didn't include surgery. Invasion of the body generally was frowned on by the church, though we do see medical operations carried out occasionally in an emergency. Generally, though, treatment included hygiene, bed rest, comfortable bedding, fresh food, better food, and most importantly, within a medieval monastic context, prayer. Surgery was only used as a last resort. It was difficult and very dangerous in an era before there were anaesthetics or antibiotics to control infection. And in fact, archaeologists very, very rarely find skeletons with any evidence of medical intervention, or indeed with very much evidence of any damage or unusual abnormalities on the skeleton at all. These are very, very uncommon, even in a monastic cemetery with a hospital. So then what happened after the monastery closed? Well, it was shut down by Henry VIII in 1539 as part of the dissolution of all the monasteries across England. The hospital likewise closed. People thereafter would have had to rely on local people to provide medical treatment, and this really wasn't regulated at all. Almost anyone could set themselves up as a doctor. The monastic properties were sold off, although the church building itself, minus the chancel, the end where the altar had been, most of the church building was retained and became the parish church for the village of Thorney. But the area around the monastery, with some of the larger houses, some of them actually built using stone from the monastic buildings, or indeed other timbers probably, it remained the most popular part of the village that was inhabited by the sort of wealthier members of the community, like doctors and lawyers. So what was done to make doctors safer if for a long time they weren't really regulated at all? Well, there wasn't much in the way of regulation until the Apothecaries Act in 1815, and this actually required doctors to be trained. They had to have attended lectures on anatomy, which involved observing dissections of the human body. Now, this was a really good idea in principle, but unfortunately, there was a not very much source of human bodies. The only legal source was executed criminals, and the demand for these far exceeded supply. As a result, standards of training remained very uneven. This Bonner's book here comments that in 1830 a medical practitioner could have had the highest level of training at a university like Oxford or Cambridge, one of the still few universities in the UK at that time, but they could have had training at a top university, or it could have just been a few courses in the local hospital, or what he describes as broom and apron apprenticeship in an apothecary shop, which really doesn't sound very sophisticated. So although people were supposed to be trained, it was a little bit hit and miss. The lack of bodies for these dissections to be demonstrated with caused a short-lived but serious problem of people actually digging up recently buried bodies to try and sell them to the teaching hospitals. And as a result of this, the law was changed in 1832 when the Anatomy Act regulated that there were other sources of bodies, particularly people who died unknown with no family. Their bodies could be used for dissection. The situation slowly improved. The Medical Act in 1858 set up the General Medical Council, which had a responsibility to ensure that people practicing medicine were properly trained and qualified. But for much of the 19th century, certainly the first half of it, medical training was a little bit hit and miss. So, who then lived in the Thorney Bones house in the 19th century? Now, it would be interesting to know who lived there before, but we have no records for that. But in the 19th century, we do. In 1841, the census lists a William Clapham living there with his son, John Clapham, and they're both doctors. Now, we know they were living somewhere in Thorney, though we don't know precisely where. John Clapham had 3 sons who all became doctors. So father, son, and 3 grandsons were all doctors, and 2 of the grandsons stayed in Thorney. By 1851, John Clapham, William Clapham has died by then, John Clapham has an assistant, Lee Richardson. By 1861, the record actually states that the Claphams are living in the parsonage area of Thorney, which includes just 3 houses, one of which is the Thorney Bones house. By 1881, John and Lawrence Clapham are recorded as living specifically at the named Thorney Bones house address. So we know that family of doctors are living in the house where those bones turned up by 1881, and they've probably been there for the previous 2 or 3 generations. Families tended to stay in the same houses. And by 1910, the son, again, the great-grandson, is recorded as, again, still owning that house. So we've got a medical family, a family of doctors, 3, 4 generations of doctors living in Thorney, almost certainly at the house of the Thorney Bones. So that's a bit of background evidence. Now have a look at your notes, at your answers to each of those questions that I've just gone through. And take a little bit of time to talk your ideas over and write down what you think your answers are to the following questions. So, are any of those bones likely to be prehistoric or Roman? What do you think? Which of the bones do you think could possibly be from a monastic cemetery? Which of them look as if they were actually buried? And which of them don't have evidence which looks very, very unlike medieval medical practice? And which of the bones were probably not from the monastic cemetery? Which ones look as if they've had something done to them that people in the medieval period, those medieval monks, just wouldn't have done? Which of the bones do you think would have been interesting to a doctor? Why do you think they would have been interesting to a doctor? And then which of the bones could have been used to teach doctors? And how do you think they could have been used to teach doctors? And then who do you think acquired those bones? Why did they acquire them? How did they acquire them? And when do you think they acquired them? And finally, why do you think they were buried in the garden? So take a bit of time to think carefully, go through your notes, discuss your ideas, and try and come up with answers to those questions that will help you answer that big question we set at the beginning. Why are this set of bones in the garden? So to run through some of those answers, the first question was, are any of the bones likely to be prehistoric or Roman? It seems very unlikely. We know of no archaeology nearby. So we think they're probably not. Iron Age, we don't get any burials anyway, but we don't have anything nearby. Which of the bones could possibly be from a monastic cemetery? Well, the first one, number one, with that green stain, has certainly been buried, and that's very characteristic of a medieval burial, that staining from the headdress. That's almost certainly come from a medieval cemetery. Whether it's come from the Thorney cemetery is, of course, much more difficult to say. The injury to it is clearly of medical interest, but could have easily been sustained in the medieval period. There's nothing characteristically modern about that injury. The next couple of bones could be from the monastic cemetery. Both of those are sort of infections or acquired deformities which could have occurred in the medieval period. There's nothing distinctively modern about them. Number four, though, that's much less likely to be from the medieval cemetery. We occasionally get craniotomized skulls, but they're very uncommon. Sawing is not very widely used, and those cut marks are very fine. So number four is very unlikely to be from the medieval cemetery. Numbers 5, 6, and 7, those gruesome breaks and fused bones, could be from a medieval cemetery. They're quite serious injuries. We very uncommonly find serious breaks like that in medieval cemeteries. But they certainly are the sort of break that could have occurred. Breaks like that are more common in slightly later periods as industrialisation took grip, and more serious injuries were more likely to be sustained. But certainly those tibia and fibula, lower leg injuries, are easily sustainable from a violent game of football, for example, which was played in the medieval period. So 5, 6, and 7 could be from the medieval cemetery. 8, it could have been a medieval amputation, but they're so rare. It's much more likely to be a more recent amputation. It may have been someone practicing on a recently dead body, practicing their amputation skills, or it may have been an attempt at amputation that didn't succeed. Remember, those bones have been handled. So they clearly have become part of a teaching collection. And again, bones 9, the ninth bones there. Again, those were those wired together skeletons. Very unlikely to have come from a medieval cemetery, because trying to drill through a bone like that when it's an old archaeological example, it's very difficult to do that cleanly without the bone fracturing, because it's got very dry. And that is another reason why 8 is unlikely to have been anyone sort of practicing amputation on an archaeological medieval bone, because if you'd done that on a bone that had been drying out for a long time, the bone would have splintered, whereas it's quite a clean cut, that saw mark. So that's a sort of summary of which bones could and could not have come from a monastic cemetery. So that hints at there being more than one source for those bones. It's often easy to think that we're looking for one simple explanation, but it looks as if these bones may have come from different places. Some of them could have come from the Thorney cemetery. We really wouldn't expect one monastic cemetery to produce this many abnormalities, those fractures, those strange growths. We just wouldn't expect that many. So it looks as if, even if some of them came from the Thorney medieval cemetery, others came from further afield. Because the next question, which ones would have been of interest to a doctor, is, well, all of them, really. They've all got something about them that somebody could have used either just as a curiosity, because they're a doctor, they're interested in the human skeleton. But of course, they could also have been used for teaching. And certainly those bones, the ones that have become patinated, become smoothed and worn from handling, numbers 8 and 9, and those craniotomized skulls, those are very classic of teaching. So it looks as if some of the bones we use for teaching, some of them may have just been curiosities, but even the curiosities could have been used for teaching. So who do we think acquired the bones? I wonder who you came up with. The suspicion must be that it was William or John Clapham, probably in the early part of the 19th century, when doctors were expected to be trained or to train others. And it looks like a collection perhaps that they've assembled at a time when it was difficult to get hold of bodies to train yourself properly on, and when perhaps the training that you'd undertaken might not have had quite such good access to those anatomical dissections that were really required. So it probably postdates the 1815 Apothecaries Act, but probably predates the 1832 Anatomy Act. But as we've seen, even up to the 1850s, the actual extent to which the kind of letter of the law about training was followed was a little bit uneven. So this looks like a collection that somebody's probably put the word out that if anyone digging anywhere finds a cemetery, so some of them might have been Roman, a Roman cemetery might have been found. If people knew that the doctors in Thorney were interested in getting hold of bones with interesting characteristics about them, people would have bought them and I'm sure sold them to the doctors. And why were they buried in the garden? Well, one could suspect that some of the bones may not have been acquired entirely legally, especially some of those sort of fresh amputation efforts. Were those slightly illicit? In which case that would be a reason to conceal them in the garden. But it's equally just as likely that by the end of the 19th century, these sort of collections weren't needed anymore. Doctors were being properly trained in hospitals, and in any case, at least some of the Claphams in Thorney were no longer doctors anyway. The last member of the family who died in the First World War is actually a farmer and not living at that address in any case. Now, if you've come up with different answers or other ideas, that's fine, because Archaeology is always about looking at the evidence to piece together an idea. There are always other ideas that can come up. So I hope you've enjoyed seeing how we could use different strands of evidence to explain that collection. They didn't come from one source with one explanation, however complicated. They probably came from lots of different sources, and you need different sorts of knowledge to put together that explanation. I hope you've also seen that evidence we have for really quite serious disability in the really quite distant past, at a time when people's ability to access care, to set a bone properly, was clearly limited because those broken bones weren't set properly. But nonetheless, people who had been quite severely disabled were looked after. They lived on. They were looked after and cared for by their communities. And it's also told you a little bit about how medical practice has evolved as well, and how perhaps one Cambridgeshire family of doctors did their best to try and ensure they had the best possible training that they could get at the time. And why does this matter? Well, it gives us an opportunity to feel very grateful for the medical facilities and the NHS that we have today, for the drugs, for the anaesthetics, for the antiseptics, for the antibiotics that we have today. And it also enables us to get some empathy for people who've lived at different sorts of times in the past, both those who suffered illness and those who tried to treat it. So I hope you've enjoyed that Thorney problem from Thorney, and hope to see you again at another dig school in the future.